Is there any ancient civilization that's more fascinating than ancient Egypt?
How exactly were the pyramids built?
And how did ancient Egypt become so advanced in math, geometry, engineering, and all of these other things?
What if you lived in ancient Egypt? Today on What If Discussed.
Welcome to What If Discussed. I'm Richard Garner.
And I'm Peter Smeechan. And Richard, the level of fascination around Egypt, and especially ancient Egypt, is well documented. There's movies, documentaries, books all written about it. I know kids love ancient Egypt. Everybody wants to know about mummification, about the pyramids and who built the pyramids.
Cleopatra, and that type of stuff. Yeah.
There's so fascinating, but it's also so mystical and mysterious,
for sure.
I guess. By design by the Egyptians, maybe? I don't know. What about being in ancient Egypt? Have you ever pictured yourself living in sort of their day-to-day world?
Well, it's funny you use the word mystical, because that might be the explanation for why not. No, the answer would be, for the most part, no. Up till leading up to this show, no. I hadn't, because, to your point, there's so much wildly big picture, cool, the pyramids and, you know, the Sphinx and the Nile and all that, Cleopatra and all this. It has this mystical level of not just reputation, but history that, have I thought much about the farmer or the peasant and what day-to-day life of going to the market and or planting your crops? No, I hadn't. And it's interesting because the archaeology in Egypt that we're so familiar with is almost exclusively around the tombs, around, you know, pyramids, etc. But we don't know much about the life of the everyday person in Egypt, which is interesting.
I picture myself in ancient Egypt, but not necessarily, and actually I picture myself in every ancient civilization, but usually not as the farmer or as the peasant or as somebody building the pyramids. I always picture myself as the Pharaoh, or if I'm in Greece, I'm Socrates, or you know, if I'm in England, I'm Shakespeare or something like that.
So it shall be written, so it shall be done. One of my favorite movie quotes, speaking of pharaohs, and it's interesting because of all the modern day movies around Egypt, there was Exodus that was, it was kind of the remake or the reboot of the Ten Commandments story. It wasn't very good. There's been the Mummy and stuff like that. But really you have to go back to 1956 and the Ten Commandments, which I've probably seen, I don't know, hundreds of times. It's on every year. It's like...
I've watched it 0 times.
You've never watched it?
Don't know.
What?
I'm not interested in that sort of...
It's a 4-hour Cecil B. DeMille epic.
Exactly why I haven't watched it.
Charlton Heston as Moses?
Who watches Charlton Heston should not be... Moses.
Well, I mean, yes, history has not been kind to the reputation of Charlton Heston, nor has Charlton Heston been kind to the reputation.
And 4-hour movies don't stand up for me.
But Yul Brynner, to your point about the Pharaoh, it just has this great line as the Pharaoh and you know, it says it 3 or 4 times throughout the movie when it's big dramatic moment, somebody says something, somebody asks, so it shall be written, so it shall be done, which is interesting because we'll be talking later to both Dr. Salima Ikram and Dr. Bob Breyer about how much this particular society focused on writing and recording their own history.
Right, yeah, pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Let's get to our first guest. Let me introduce her to you. Combining an interest in and understanding of the past with a passion for preserving it for the future, Dr. Salima Ikram is one of the most respected Egyptologists in the world. She fell in love with Egypt after visiting there with her family as a 9-year-old. Dr. Ikram currently holds the position of Distinguished Professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Ikram is also an archaeologist, an author, and a renowned thought leader on all matters Egypt, appearing in television shows all over the world.
Dr. Ikram, thanks for joining us.
It is my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And we talked a little bit in your bio about that sort of fated trip as a 9-year-old girl visiting Egypt and then falling in love. And obviously it's certainly informing a lot of the rest of your life. Talk about that initial spark and why just generally people just have this incredible fascination with ancient Egypt.
Well, I mean, I think for everyone it's a little bit different, but I think one of the things is that it's the art, the images are so compelling and the buildings are so compelling that people are sucked in. It's beautiful, it's strange, and certainly things like the pyramids, they're huge. So I think there's a lot of impact, and for many people it's also the idea that thousands of years ago, human beings, without the kind of modern machinery that we have today, were able to construct such extraordinary structures and to live very rich lives, leaving behind all of this civilization, art, culture, literature.
Tell us about the hierarchical system in ancient Egypt. Obviously, it existed in a lot of ancient cultures, but in Egypt, how did where you stood in the hierarchy determine how your life turned out?
As far as we know, the ancient Egyptians were fairly hierarchical, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't move between levels. So if you were a pharaoh, your life would be very different than if you were a peasant, or if you were a soldier, or if you were, a sailor. So it's just like it is today, but sometimes it was a bit more stringent in terms of the hierarchical setup.
Yeah, no doubt. And like you said, it's very similar to today, and it's very similar to other ancient cultures. There's been hierarchy forever, and it does dictate your life experience. If we were to talk, let's say, less Pharaoh and more, I don't want to say average Joe, but somebody who would have been closer to either a farmer or a peasant, what would some of the day in the life experience be? What do you eat? Where do you kind of work? What do you do for fun? Those types of things.
So, I mean, again, it depends how rich you were, how poor you were. But I think everyone, including the king, would live in a mud brick house. If you were a king, it was a bigger house. If you were not, it would be a smaller house with less beautiful decorations. So you'd go off and you'd do your work. People had a variety of things that they ate, but it's quite interesting that the basis of the diet would have been the same, but rich people ate a lot more meat than poor people. So they would have a lot of lentils and pulses and vegetables and bread and beer and onions, which were the mainstays for the peasantry.
Sorry, just to be clear, you did mention beer. There was beer in ancient Egypt?
Oh, yes. I mean, beer was one of the main food groups. And in fact, I'm nervous about drinking water because the wine sometimes in Nile was not very clean. So beer was a safe thing to do, and that's why everyone drank beer for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And of course, there was also wine.
Yeah, that was actually very popular in ancient cultures because the water wasn't always so pure. We've talked a bit about the life of the people in ancient Egypt, but what about the death of people in ancient Egypt? Everyone knows a little about mummies, but you've done a lot of studies into mummification. Maybe you can tell us what exactly was it and why was it so important to the Egyptians?
Well, I mean, some people think the ancient Egyptians were obsessed by death, but that's just because we've dug up a lot of tombs. But in a way, they were obsessed by life and they wanted to live forever. And since they could not sort of freeze themselves or do anything like that, the next best thing was to mummify themselves, equip their tombs with everything that they liked best, or else if they couldn't afford that, they'd draw that on the tomb walls so that when they would be resurrected, because they believed that after you died, you passed a series of tests. And then if you passed them properly, you would live forever in the fields of Yaru, where you have all the best of whatever hell it is you wanted. And so to ensure that, it was painted in your tomb. And if you were too poor to have a painted tomb, people threw in a few pots and pans and whatever it was that they could, and your favorite dishes, and they said the word, so that may you have 1,000 of bread, 1,000 of beer, 1,000 of all good things. And sometimes they'd name them. And then you could just, hopefully, if it worked, you would wind up with that in the hereafter forever and ever.
Sounds like a good deal.
Yeah, it sounds like sort of carries on to this day in like teenage bedrooms where they've got posters of things they aspire to have in, I guess, in the afterlife.
Well, and I'm going to count on you, Peter, to make sure and pack my tomb with a couple of things that you know are important to me.
Pots and pans.
And you mentioned tombs, and of course, for a lot of people, those early pictures and sort of black and white film that came out of Howard Carter and the uncovering of Tutankhamun, and that really sort of excited the world, partly because the media was there now to sort of disseminate those pictures and to really sort of lend to the fascination. But what we hear these days is that there's still a whole bunch more to be found in Egypt. And in fact, some people put the estimates at, there's still like 50%, maybe even 70% of what's to be excavated that's still quote unquote under the sand. If you were given sort of carte blanche and knowing what you probably know about what's rumored to be under the sand, what would you want to excavate and why?
Well, there are all sorts of very useful things that one could try and excavate, because I think it would be nice to do a city properly or an entire cemetery properly. But what it would also be great fun to do would be to go and be in search of Cambyses' army that allegedly got covered by a sandstorm and was buried and is somewhere out in the Western desert, which would be fabulous to come upon. Because then we'd find out, how many people were in the army, how many camels, what kind of equipment they had, what they needed in terms of food and drink for their expedition. But there are many tombs, both royal and non-royal, that have yet to be found. To go in search of that would be also great fun if you could find them intact.
Kind of creates an image of, like for me anyways, of this sort of the terracotta warriors in China. Although those were statues. You're talking, these were 10,000 real people from the Persian army.
Yep, real people who went off into the desert, and then they got caught in the sandstorm. So they've been, basically, I do think about them in the same way as the terracotta army, because you keep thinking you'll come upon them and they'll all be sort of either straight or else in positions a bit like Pompeii, where you had people frozen in that snapshot of time. And also it'd be very good to excavate a full city or even part of a city to see how people lived and find out, where did they go to the bathroom? What kind of rubbish disposal did they have? What kind of cooking did they do?
Well, they were ahead of their time in advancements, as far as we can tell. But what do you think came first? Their advancements or their understanding of math and geometry and engineering that led to their better life? Or was it their better life that allowed them to come up with these light speed advancements?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. It's very chicken and egg. But probably at some point they must have had the idea first that led to some advancement. And after that, they could have, once they were more settled, I think once you have a good agricultural system and you're not killing each other, then there's time to come up with ideas and improvements. And then you can come up with you will come up with social hierarchy and just general making things a bit more complicated, complex society and culture. Because in fact, it's sort of when you have that space and time that people come up with some excellent ideas.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting and fascinating topic, like we talked about off the top. And like you said, there's still so much more to know, so much more to discover, so much more to excavate. And a lot of those discoveries would lead us to having even more answers as to what that daily life, what it would have been like to live in ancient Egypt. And again, we're talking about even different times in history. We say ancient Egypt, but how much time does that really cover? How many thousands of years are we talking when we're talking about quote unquote ancient Egypt?
And that's a very good point, because Pharaonic Egypt, when Egypt was unified into one country, is 3,000 years until the Romans came when Cleopatra lost the plot. And then the Romans took over. So we have 3,000 years of unified Egyptian history. And then before that, you have about 2,000 years where there were lots of city-states or equivalent, bands roaming around, but you had some sort of entity in the land that we now call Egypt. In fact, Egypt is probably the only country which has had an active historic national life, if you can call it that, for 5,000 years in basically the same geographic area, which is astounding.
So we talked about a lot of different things about Egypt that made them sort of unique. And again, you referenced kind of even how they documented things in terms of the pictures and the images that sort of capture people's imagination. But the fact that they documented the way they did and to the extent that they did isn't random either. They really understood the importance of that to the point even of making education, reading and writing, available to more than just the elite. Talk a little bit about that and how that ended up manifesting in the advanced societies that we know of now.
Well, I mean, we're still trying to learn more about this, but as far as we know, temples had schools, and that each town or even village had a temple. And it wasn't just the children of the elite who might go there or have tutors, but we think that often there might have been children from around the village whose parents were working in the temple, and everyone had a chance pretty much to do that for at least 3 to 4 months a year. So this gave the kids a chance to come in and learn some basic reading, writing, arithmetic, and if they showed promise, they could be taken under the wing of someone and then be advanced. And of course, there was a patronage system. So if you found someone who liked your parents or liked you or thought you had promise, you really could move up in the ranks. So there are people, for example, like Queen Hatshepsut's chief architect and master of works, who seemed to have come from a very humble background, but yet he wound up being at the right hand of the queen and creating one of the most beautiful monuments to survive from ancient Egypt, her temple at Deir al-Bahari. So you can see that there was some degree of social mobility. And what's nice is the ancient Egyptians had autobiographies in their tombs. And like any autobiography, it's not always going to be 100% true, but enough to see. They say, well, I started off like this, and then I made so-and-so happy because I worked so well, and I got this. And then you can see how they rise through the ranks and sometimes wind up, being a vizier for the king.
It shows a pretty sort of, I'd even say a mature society, because for so many other ancient cultures, they used education and knowledge to prevent people from rising up through the ranks. Egypt obviously shows
embraced it.
Embracing it probably leads to advancements and other things, right?
Well, tell us about the advancements, because as we say, they were a very intelligent people. What kind of advancements did they bring to the world in terms of maybe just in math or geometry or in science? Like, what types of things have they brought us that are maybe still in use today?
Well, I mean, certainly I think a lot of the astronomy that then later on got passed on to the Greeks and cycled through, because you have a lot, and medicine, a lot of ancient Egyptian medical knowledge, again, got passed through the Greeks and on. And so a lot of the blood circulation and things that we think about, Galen, some of the ideas were actually from ancient Egypt. And you have to remember, the Museum, which is basically a mega university and think tank, the first of its kind, was based in Alexandria. And people from all over the world, well, the ancient world, would come here and study and then take ideas back. And this was a great melting pot for ideas. And it really has influenced me. In fact, Egyptian art and architecture also influenced the Greeks. And they wrote and said, we've learned this from the Egyptians. Then they went off and had a riff on it. And then they did something completely different. So when people are looking at classical Greek columns, etc., and going on about the Doric order, that was actually born in ancient Egypt, 2,000 years before the Greeks did anything with it.
Typical Greeks, taking credit for everything. Democracy. We could go on, and it's interesting because I have sort of a different image now of this ancient Egypt that, for a lot of people ends up being a couple of pyramids, the Sphinx. I think we have a sort of a broader idea of a really functional, interesting society that for its time in history actually showed a lot of, like I said, sort of maturity in embracing not a super balanced system, but certainly something that was a little more than just straight oppression and hierarchy.
Yeah,
I mean, but again, the reason why we know so much about it today, we'd know more if the Library of Alexandria wasn't burnt down, but Peter, that's a story for another.
What if?
Yep, that's a sad one.
We'll bring you back for that one, because honestly, we could go on forever here, and we know you're busy, and you are literally in Egypt at the American University in Cairo. So thanks for taking the time for joining us today. Where can people find more about your work?
Well, I think there's Oh God. I think there's a web page and the university web page, and I have a Facebook professional page.
And I have seen both of those things, and your websites, actually, I encourage people to just Google Dr. Salima Ikram. Anything coming up in the future? I know obviously the world we're living in has kind of suspended a lot of the speaking tours and shows that were in production. What do you have coming up?
I'm afraid all of my speaking tours are on hold, but certainly there are a couple of TV productions coming up about Tutankhamun and also about mummification. So watch out in Discovery, Nat Geo, and the History Channel.
We'll keep our eyes open for that. Again, really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ikram.
My pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. Take care.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Great stuff with Dr. Ikram.
Yeah.
Obviously, like we said off the top, this is a thought leader, one of the foremost Egyptologists in the world. You could even say a genius, Pete.
Would you say policy genius?
I would say an Egypt genius, but in this case, you might talk about policy genius.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about policy genius. You know, with everything going on right now, a lot of people are asking, is it even possible to buy life insurance? Well, what do you think?
I would think possibly, but I'm the type of person who doesn't know.
The short answer, Richard, is yes. You can buy life insurance during a pandemic, and if you have loved ones, depending on your income, you probably should. Policy Genius is an insurance marketplace, and they're in contact with the life insurance companies on their platform every day, keeping track of all the changes in the market so you don't have to.
Got my attention.
Which means they can get you covered quickly and for the best price. Here's how it works. Policy Genius compares quotes from the top life insurance companies in one place. It takes just a few minutes to compare quotes from the top insurers to find your best price. This doesn't just save you legwork. You know what else it's going to save you?
I'm going to guess money.
It's going to save you $1,500 or more every year by using Policy Genius. So if you're one of the many people looking to buy life insurance right now, but you're not sure where to start, head to policygenius.com. Policy Genius will find you the best rate and handle the process completely. They'll get you and your family protected and hopefully give you one less thing to worry about.
And who wants more things to worry about right now?
Oh my gosh, I've got so many things to worry about.
Well,
right
I think you're not alone.
No,
obviously in that case.
I mean, pandemic aside, I've got a broken computer. I've got kids out of school.
The struggle is real, Pete.
Oh my gosh,
the struggle is real. But the good news is we get to talk to people occasionally, like Dr. Salima Ikram,
right, and
learn cool things about ancient Egypt, which we're both fascinated by. And I don't know about you, sort of what your takeaways were. But there were things, again, you think you've sort of covered it all, you've read it all, you've watched documentaries about Egypt, you think you know everything, but all of a sudden you talk to somebody like Dr. Salima Ikram and you learn things. What did you learn?
Oh my gosh, well first, I didn't realize that so much of Greek culture was stolen from ancient Egyptian culture. And I have a lot of Greek friends, and I live in a Greek neighborhood. It's nothing against the Greeks, but yes, apparently a lot of their intelligence,
yes,
a lot of their architecture was taken from designs from
inspired, if you will, by Egypt.
Yeah, you can say inspired,
yes,
because it's 3,000 years later.
Yes.
Which was another thing that really floored me, is that I don't really see ancient Greece being 3,000 years after ancient Egypt.
And that speaks to, obviously, when we're talking about being advanced in stuff like math and geometry and whatever, and alliance, you talked about astronomy, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, I'm sure you've heard, if you've done even a slight sort of superficial dig on Egypt, that the three, the Great Pyramid and the three pyramids are aligned with Orion. I mean, I don't know where you start to be able to have, going back 5,000 years from now, to be able to be like, yeah, we know where the precession of the equinox is going to be at this particular time over the course, whatever. They obviously knew way more than we would give people credit for going that far back. And then there were interactions between ancient Greeks and ancient Egyptians. There was an idea of understanding and learning from each other going that far back as well. But the one thing that is clear is that, we talk about Greeks, democracy and a lot of things, even some of the architecture, she talked about the columns, right? Like we had talked about this, well, whatever. And then she's like, no, actually that was not stolen, inspired.
Inspired by the ancient Egyptians.
By the ancient Egyptians.
And I wonder if that's what the Library of Alexandria might have been adorned with.
Like, honestly, like, you don't want to sort of overstate things, but if I had the time machine that every once in a while we discussed and we'd like to have, and I could go anywhere and do anything, It might be to bring a fire extinguisher to, whatever happens. I don't know if it's Alexander the Great that is credited with burning down the Library of Alexandria, but from all accounts, there's a myriad of things we would understand better about the world, not just ancient Egypt, but the world if we had access to all that information.
It's gone, and so is most of ancient Egypt, buried beneath the sand. And I think you were saying 60%?
Well, I mean, you hear different ranges, but most people agree, most Egyptologists even agree that it's at least 50%. Interesting that, yes, the modern day challenges of money and budgets and resources get into why there hasn't been more excavation in Egypt. But you can speculate that if this is what we've dug up so far, right? Can you imagine what else is under there?
Yeah.
Because it's not going to be just like, if their focus is on temples, on big stone structures, on big things for the afterlife with, these hieroglyphics and unbelievable things on the walls, those are the things that stand the test of time, especially if you're talking about being buried under the sand. So they would come out, you don't want to say pristine, but you look at some of the stuff you see in Egypt right now, it's like, it looks pristine. It's
yeah.
Like,
I mean,
it's
other
incredible.
than being aged.
Other than being aged, but I mean, when you're talking 4,000 or 5,000 years before, what you can walk up to some of these walls and read stuff on the walls. Like it's been well preserved. Some of it because it's sort of inside, right? But I don't know. Have you been to Egypt?
I've never been. No, I'd love to.
Who could we talk to here about getting us to Egypt? Perhaps doing a remote from Egypt.
That'd be cool. You mentioned a time machine earlier. Maybe if we could invest in one of those. That might be good for the show to have a time machine. I think we could visit many different places.
And that is a story.
That's a story for another What If. But one other thing that Dr. Ikram mentioned was the soldiers.
Yes.
The procession of soldiers, and they're just lost underneath the sand.
So, and the terracotta warrior thing was a good reference, which is also, interestingly enough, in that series with Brendan Fraser, Mummy, and then it's the
Mummy, yeah.
And then
I didn't watch that.
Yeah,
I didn't see that. I didn't see National Treasure.
I'm starting to guess you didn't do it.
Listen, I liked Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Well, he gets to Egypt, right? At some point,
yeah.
And obviously the talk of the terracotta warriors is interesting because you see these sort of statues, but this is supposed to be people. This was obviously a sort of a brigade of soldiers, Persian soldiers coming towards Egypt. Perhaps this is a divine intervention by the sun god Ra, or however it would have been seen by ancient Egyptians, that they were somehow saved by a fortuitous sandstorm that apparently. But it sounds like one of those next great sort of archaeological challenges is finding exact location, first of all, which is probably challenging, but to be able to dig up and see what you could learn by discovering that. But again, it sounds like we got a lot of answers today, we got a lot of insights, but for me, it's almost there's now more questions than answers because I'm more curious about what it is that we don't know versus what it is that we do.
Yeah. There's a lot we don't know. And there's a lot you can find out, because if you enjoyed this episode, let's carry on the conversation. Let's spend more time with the topic. Click on the description, click on the link in the description below, and that'll take you to the extended audio version of the podcast. Dr. Bob Breyer will join us, one of the world's foremost experts on mummies and Egyptology. So on behalf of Richard Garner and myself, Peter Smeechin, thanks very much for joining us. We'll see you again on What If Discussed.